From superstar to out of the NBA, what happened to Demarcus Cousins? Demarcus Cousins was drafted 5th overall in the 2010 NBA draft to the Sacramento Kings. Coming out of college, Demarcus Cousins was known as one of those centers that could just literally do everything. He was a pretty good ball handler for his position. He was a pretty good passer as well. He could shoot the mid-range shot. He could somewhat shoot that three-point shot coming out of college, but he was more of a mid-range guy. He also had a great post game. The best way to describe Demarcus Cousins was just a center who could do everything on the offensive side of the ball. At that time, the new age center that we now know and love, in terms of a center being able to do everything on the offensive end in terms of catch and shoot three-point shots, hit that mid-range shot as well, be able to post up and be very efficient in that post game, as well as be able to run in the pick and roll and the pick and pop, just do everything on the offensive end, wasn't necessarily that prominent or prevalent at that time. Yeah, we definitely had a guy like Dirk Nowitzki who was a pioneer in terms of big men shooting, but he was more of a power forward. So at that time, Demarcus Cousins was one of the first players, really one of the first centers I should say, that we had in the NBA that could truly do everything on the offensive side of the ball. So that made him somewhat of a unicorn. And right away, as soon as Demarcus Cousins came to the NBA and started playing for the Sacramento Kings, he was instantly seen as a guy who could potentially be a superstar in this league, and he was proving the Sacramento Kings right for drafting him 5th overall. Keep in mind that a lot of these stats are deflated from where they are now, and if Demarcus Cousins was playing back then in the same NBA we have now, his stats would be a lot better. But in Demarcus' rookie season, he put up 14 points per game in 2010, which is actually pretty good, at 43% shooting, 8 rebounds, and 2.5 assists. Keep in mind that 2.5 assists, which is pretty good for a center, especially back then. But in the next season, he completely jumped out and broke out and actually averaged 18 points a game on 45% shooting, 11 rebounds per game, and 1.6 assists. And every season after that, he continuously got better until in the 2016 NBA season, which ended up being his last season with the Sacramento Kings. Everybody knew Demarcus Cousins was an absolute legitimate superstar and maybe even the best center in the NBA. At that point, there were very little questions about Demarcus Cousins' actual skill level and talent level. Everybody knew this guy was one of the most talented players we have in the NBA. But the real question at this point was Demarcus Cousins was playing on the Sacramento Kings, and for years now they've always been a bottom feeder of the NBA. And even though Demarcus Cousins was putting up incredible numbers night in and night out, especially in that 2016 NBA season, overall the Kings just weren't winning, and there were some concerns about Demarcus Cousins if he was a winning player and why the Kings weren't winning when Demarcus Cousins was putting up incredible numbers. So eventually the Kings decided to move on from Demarcus, and there was some problems within both sides, but eventually the Kings did end up trading Demarcus Cousins to team up with Anthony Davis on the New Orleans Pelicans. And now a lot of people were very excited to see how these two absolute superstars and top centers in the NBA would pair together. And unfortunately for Demarcus Cousins, this was actually the beginning of the end for him, and due to no fault of his own, by the way. Demarcus Cousins was actually traded to the Pelicans midway through the season, actually right after the All-Star game. Whenever you trade for a new player, especially a superstar in general, and you have to integrate him into your new offense, it's always very difficult to do, because when you're bringing in a superstar into your team, you kind of have to completely change your offense and cater to that superstar, and Demarcus Cousins was definitely a superstar at that point. But when you're talking about trading for Demarcus Cousins midway through the season, that makes it even more difficult and basically impossible to completely get your chemistry right with all your teammates. A great example, in my opinion, of a team that was in somewhat of a similar position of bringing in superstars together was the Miami Heat. In their initial season, bringing in that big three of Chris Bosh, LeBron James, and Dwayne Wade, obviously on paper, they were unbeatable. They had an incredible amount of talent. Nobody had a better team on paper than the Miami Heat did. But in that initial season, their chemistry wasn't all there, and they actually ended up losing to the Dallas Mavericks in that first season, even though the Heat were obviously the more talented team by far, by the way. But that just shows you how difficult it is to really get your chemistry right when you're bringing in superstars to a team. And they had an entire season. They did that during the offseason and had a full season to get their chemistry right and going into the playoffs. The New Orleans Pelicans didn't even have that. They have midway through the season they got Demarcus Cousins, so that just makes it so much more difficult. But although the season didn't turn out the way that the Pelicans wanted it to go, not making the playoffs and being the 10th seed in the Western Conference, towards the end of the season there was some hope, because Demarcus Cousins and Anthony Davis and the Pelicans as a team was finally starting to click, and both Anthony Davis and Demarcus Cousins were putting up crazy numbers, and they were actually going on a winning streak, winning like crazy as well. So going into the next season, there was some hope that these two could potentially work out together, because that was actually a pretty big question going into that trade. But going into the next season, now the Pelicans had a full season under the belt, or at least a half season, but they had a full off season, and now they can really get their chemistry right and play just much better well together and just a much better offense overall. And that's exactly what happened. In the next season, in the 2017-2018 NBA season, the Pelicans were actually the 6th seed in the Western Conference with a great record of 48-34. And the Pelicans actually kind of had to gut their roster in order to get Demarcus Cousins, so they didn't really have that much help for these guys, and they really had a big three of Rajon Rondo, Anthony Davis, and Demarcus Cousins. But besides that, there wasn't much help on the team, which just shows how great these three players were for them, and especially Anthony Davis and Demarcus Cousins. And just as everything was looking well, the Pelicans were finally starting to get it together and play extremely well and actually made the NBA playoffs. Demarcus Cousins ends up tearing his ACL in just a tragic injury for him. And one of the worst things about tearing your ACL, obviously it's bad in general when you play in the NBA, but especially considering that Demarcus Cousins was actually in a contract year, that was one of the worst things that could have happened to Demarcus. And going into that offseason, everybody knew that Demarcus was an absolute superstar, so Demarcus was expecting pretty big contract offers. But when those offers never came, especially from the Pelicans, which he was expecting because they had a pretty good season, but obviously the Pelicans were concerned about that ACL injury and weren't willing to offer him a huge contract, one which he would have liked. He actually ended up signing a 1-year very cheap deal with the Golden State Warriors in order to try to win an NBA championship with them when they still had their super team going with Steph Curry, Draymond Green, Klay Thompson, Kevin Durant, and now they just added Demarcus Cousins. And overall, that season with the Golden State Warriors for Demarcus Cousins was definitely a pretty good one. He averaged 16 points per game, but you can clearly tell he wasn't fully the player that he was before. But that's typically what happens coming off an ACL injury. It kind of takes you one full season of playing to really get back to what you were, and then the next season you really see the player that you were before that. But we were seeing some good strides from Demarcus Cousins. Overall, he had a pretty good season, but clearly you could tell it was a little bit of a step back from where he was previously, but that was kind of expected. And also considering he was playing on now a super team where he wasn't the main option or one of the main options, it was pretty expected and wasn't really so alarming. But then over the offseason, Demarcus Cousins' career really started to go downhill, where he actually tore his Achilles just playing in a pickup game during the offseason. And obviously when you're coming off an injury like that, you have to recover for an entire season, so Demarcus Cousins obviously missed that 2019 NBA season. And coming into that 2020 NBA season, now Demarcus Cousins went from a superstar to a guy who was not going to get a lot of money and was known as a guy who was very injury prone, but although still had a lot of potential and a lot of talent. So the Houston Rockets were willing to give a flyer on him. In that first season with the Golden State Warriors, we did see some effects from his ACL injury the preseason prior, but we saw some encouraging signs, like Demarcus Cousins was starting to play better the more he did play, and he was starting to come back. But now this second injury with that Achilles injury going into that season with the Houston Rockets, we really saw the effects. He was noticeably a lot slower and less athletic out there, and overall he just wasn't playing as well, and his Houston Rockets tenure was definitely not a successful one. The Rockets as a team were just not good that season, but Demarcus Cousins ended up only playing 25 games with the Rockets, and then the Rockets ended up cutting him, and at that point his career was looking in jeopardy. But later towards the end of the season, the Los Angeles Clippers did end up signing Demarcus Cousins and taking a flyer on him, and he definitely did provide some good minutes for that Clippers team, but that's basically all he is at this point in his career, at least at the moment. He's just a guy who can come off the bench as that center, who's a decent backup center, but he's a guy who's definitely susceptible to injuries, and that's something you do have to be worried about. But coming from the superstar that he definitely was just a few years ago, this is definitely a pretty big dive into his career. But that's basically Demarcus's career to this point. But anyways, let me know what you guys think in the comments. Do you think Demarcus Cousins could ever play again at the level that he did at that superstar level, or do you think the injuries just caught up with him and it just will become too much, and Demarcus Cousins, basically what he is now, is just a guy who comes off the bench, and that's basically it. But anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and if you did enjoy, please leave a like and subscribe and hit that post notification bell. It really helps me out a lot. Until the next time, peace out, guys.